To find a plane forgotten for 40 years, veteran Robert Holding must journey to a remote waterfall deep in the wilderness. But as the roar of the water grows louder, his only companion, a dog named Buddy, becomes agitated, trying to pull him from the path. The dog saved his life. In the middle of the trail lay a steel bear trap, set not to catch animals, but to guard a deadly secret. Robert now knows the guardian of the waterfall's secret is still lurking in the shadows, and he is not a welcome visitor. The silence in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains was a living thing. It was a thick, heavy blanket, woven with the scent of pine and damp earth, punctuated only by the whisper of wind through the Douglas firs and the distant cry of a hawk. For Robert Holding, this silence was both a sanctuary and a prison. His small, weather-beaten cabin, nestled on the edge of Washington's Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, was the only fortress he had against a world that had become too loud, too fast, too full of ghosts. Robert was a man carved from the same rugged landscape he inhabited. At 58, his tall frame was leaner than in his youth, but his broad shoulders and steady hands still spoke of a deep, resilient strength. His short brown hair was threaded with gray at the temples, a testament to years he'd rather not count. A neatly trimmed but thick beard covered a weathered face, etched with lines that told stories of hardship and a kindness he rarely showed anyone but his dog. Dressed in his usual uniform of a faded navy and gray plaid shirt worn open over a gray t-shirt, worn blue jeans and sturdy work boots, he seemed a part of the wilderness that surrounded him. His only companion in this self-imposed exile was Buddy, an 8-year-old German shepherd. Buddy was a magnificent animal, his thick coat a striking mix of sable and gray, his intelligent amber eyes missing nothing. A retired search and rescue dog, he moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned professional. His loyalty to Robert was absolute and unquestionable. He was more than a pet. He was an anchor, the one steady presence that kept Robert from being swept away entirely by the turbulent waters of his memory. The mornings were the worst. That's when the dreams came. Fragments of howling wind, blinding snow, and a young, terrified face forever seared into his mind's eye. He would wake with a jolt, his heart hammering against his ribs, the cold sweat of the nightmare clinging to him. On this particular morning, the phantom chill was so real, he could feel it in his bones. He sat up, gasping for the cool mountain air, his gaze sweeping the familiar Spartan interior of the cabin, but the ghosts followed him from sleep. He felt a wet nose press insistently into his palm. Buddy had moved from his spot at the foot of the bed and was now beside him, his head resting on Robert's knee, his tail thumping a slow, reassuring rhythm against the wooden floor. Robert's hand went automatically to the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. He focused on the dog's solid, warm presence, on the rhythmic beat of his tail, on the calm, steady gaze. Slowly, the frantic pace of his own heart began to slow, and the icy grip of the past began to loosen. Buddy was his only medicine, his only peace. Later that day, driven by a restless energy he couldn't contain, Robert decided to face the one place he had been avoiding for years, the old storage shed that had belonged to his father. The shed was a time capsule, filled with the remnants of a life lived with a passion Robert often felt he lacked. His father had been a nature photographer, a man who found his church in the grand cathedrals of the forest. He'd passed away a decade ago, leaving the cabin and everything in it to Robert. The air inside the shed was heavy with the smell of dust, old wood, and turpentine. Sunlight streamed through a single dirty window, illuminating dancing dust motes. Robert began sorting through old tools and fishing gear, a mindless task to occupy his hands. Buddy, however, seemed to be on a mission of his own. He ignored the interesting smells of dried bait and motor oil, heading straight for a cluttered corner in the back. He began sniffing intently at a stack of old canvases, his tail held low and stiff. A low whine escaped his throat. "What is it, boy?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Buddy ignored him, nudging one of the canvases with his nose, then looking back at Robert with an unusual intensity. He whined again, louder this time. Trusting the dog's instincts had been drilled into Robert during his years as an Air Force pararescueman, but he never got this worked up over nothing. Robert moved the canvases aside, revealing a heavy olive-drab metal case. It was a professional photographer's field case, built to withstand the elements, with heavy-duty latches and a visible rubber seal around the lid. He didn't remember ever seeing it before. Wiping away a thick layer of dust, he worked the stiff latches, which snapped open with a satisfying click. He lifted the lid, the hiss of air breaking the seal audible in the silent shed. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam padding, was his father's old 35mm film camera. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all silver and black metal, looking as pristine as the day it was made. Beside it were several small white packets of silica gel, now rock hard, their moisture-absorbing work long since done. Robert picked up the camera, its weight familiar and comforting in his hands. He ran a thumb over the cool metal, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. On a whim, he checked the film compartment. He expected it to be empty, but it wasn't. A roll of film was still inside. The counter stopped at 24 exposures. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time, stirred within him. What was on that roll? Why had his father never developed it? 100 questions bloomed in the silence of the shed. Developing film this old was a long shot, but the idea of seeing those final, forgotten images, one last message from his father, took hold. The decision felt momentous. It meant leaving his refuge. It meant driving into town, dealing with people, with noise, with the world he had worked so hard to shut out. He looked down at Buddy, who sat patiently at his feet, watching him with those amber eyes, seeming to understand the weight of the moment. "Well, boy," Robert said softly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Looks like we're taking a trip." The drive into town was an assault on the senses. After years wrapped in the deep silence of the forest, the drone of his old truck's engine felt like a roar. The cars that sped past on the highway were a blur of hostile metal. Robert kept his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, a calm, steady presence. He seemed to sense his owner's discomfort, occasionally resting his chin on Robert's thigh, his amber eyes offering silent support. Every mile away from the cabin felt like a mile in enemy territory. He found what he was looking for in a small, quiet strip mall on the outskirts of town, a tiny shop with a faded sign that read, "Evergreen Photo Lab." It looked like a relic from another era, much like the roll of film tucked safely in his shirt pocket. The man behind the counter was named Leo, a small, cheerful man in his 60s with a fringe of white hair around a bald head and a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He wore a clean, simple apron over a plaid shirt and greeted Robert with a warm, professional smile. I'd like to get this developed, Robert said, placing the film canister on the counter. The words felt clumsy. It's old, real old. Leo picked it up, examining it with a practiced eye. Well, you're not kidding, he chuckled, turning the canister over. This stuff's been out of production for a long time. Where'd you find it? In my father's old camera case, Robert explained, offering no more. I can give it a try, but I'm not making any promises, Leo told him gently. Film this old, especially if it wasn't stored right, can be completely unusable. The emulsion could be degraded, might come out blank, or just a mess of colors. I understand. Just do what you can, Robert replied. The possibility of failure was a sharp pang of disappointment, but he had to know. Come back in a couple of days, Leo said, scribbling out a claim ticket. We'll see if your father left you any magic. The 2-day wait was a special kind of torment. The trip had stirred up the hornet's nest of his anxiety, and back at the cabin, the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty, charged with expectation. He and Buddy took long, aimless hikes through the forest, the physical exertion, a welcome distraction. But his mind kept returning to the small canister in Leo's shop. When he returned, the bell above the door chimed, and Leo looked up from his work, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. Mr. Holding, I was hoping you'd come in today, he said, his voice full of excitement. He reached under the counter and produced a thick, glossy photo envelope. I honestly can't believe it. The film was almost perfectly preserved. That metal case must have been airtight. You got very lucky. Robert's heart leaped with hope. He took the envelope, his calloused fingers fumbling slightly with the flap. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He didn't look at the photos in the shop. They were private, a final conversation with his father that he needed to have alone. He walked back to his truck, Buddy whining softly in the passenger's seat, sensing the tension. Instead of starting the engine, Robert tore open the envelope. He slid out the stack of photographs. The first 20 were breathtaking. They were his father's work, unmistakably. A sunbeam piercing the dense canopy of an old-growth forest. The intricate pattern of frost on a fern frond. A majestic bull elk, antlers crowned in morning mist, staring directly into the lens. Each photo was a testament to his father's patience and his deep love for the wild. Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of pride and sorrow. Then he came to the last 3. The mood shifted instantly. The first of the 3 was a jarring, chaotic image. It was a close-up of twisted metal, a 3-bladed propeller bent into an unnatural shape against a background of dark, wet rock. He flipped to the next, his breath caught in his throat. The following photo was clearer, more damning. It showed the tail of a small, single-engine plane, a Cessna, wedged violently in a rocky ravine. It was covered in moss and vines, but the registration numbers on the rudder were still faintly visible through decades of grime. The last photo was taken from farther back. It showed the entire tragic scene. Most of the fuselage was hidden behind the shimmering curtain of a tall, slender waterfall that cascaded from a steep cliff face. The mist from the falls shrouded the wreckage, making it look ghostly, ethereal. It was a tomb sealed by water and time. Back at the cabin, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the silent screams of the past. Robert sat at his small wooden desk with the 3 photographs laid out before him, like evidence in a cold case. He powered up his old laptop, his satellite internet connection slow and laborious. His fingers, once so deft at handling rescue equipment, now felt clumsy on the keyboard. He typed the plane's tail number into the Federal Aviation Administration database. No results found. He tried the National Transportation Safety Board's accident database, searching for any reported crashes in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in the 1970s and 80s. Page after page of reports, but none matched the plane, the location, or the circumstances. It was as if the plane had simply vanished from the sky, leaving no official trace, no grieving families, no search parties. It had been swallowed by the wilderness, its final moments captured only by the silent, accidental witness of his father's camera. Robert leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his haunted face. The old instincts, the ones he had tried to bury for a decade, began to stir. The training, the discipline, the deeply ingrained sense of duty. A life had been lost out there. A story had been left unfinished. He stared at the photo of the waterfall, at the secret it held. He felt a deep, undeniable debt to the anonymous soul in that wreckage. This wasn't just about a lost plane. This was a mission left undone. A chance to finally bring someone home. The discovery of the photographs had ignited a flame inside Robert, burning away the dense, suffocating fog of his aimless days and replacing it with the sharp, clear focus of a man on a mission. The ghosts of the past were still there, but now they were at his back, pushing him forward instead of holding him down. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't just surviving, he was preparing. The floor of his small cabin became his command center. He unrolled a series of topographical maps of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, a complex web of contour lines, rivers, and trails spreading out before him. He pinned the corners with books and coffee mugs, creating a mosaic of the wilderness that separated him from his objective. The 3 photographs lay at the center, a stark and constant reminder of his purpose. His finger, calloused and steady, traced the faint blue lines of rivers and the dense brown clusters that signified steep terrain. He studied the wide-angle photograph of the waterfall his father had taken, comparing the unique curve of the cliff face and the surrounding ridges to the patterns on the map. He triangulated the position from the visible peaks in the background, his mind a practiced calculator of distance and elevation. After hours of intense concentration, he circled a small, remote area deep in a valley, virtually untouched by marked trails. On an older, more detailed map from his father's collection, the area was marked with a faint, handwritten note. Silent Falls. The name sent a shiver down his spine. This was the place, the destination. Phase 2 began, the ritual of preparation. He moved to the large wooden footlocker at the end of his bed, a container he hadn't opened since he'd left the service. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside, the tools of his former life lay dormant, each piece a vessel of potent memories. He laid everything out on the floor with meticulous precision. A 45-meter climbing rope, its nylon sheath still in perfect condition. He ran the rope through his hands, the familiar texture a comfort. He checked the harness, the metal buckles, the webbing. Next came the hardware, a collection of carabiners, ascenders, and descenders, each one clicking softly as he inspected it for any sign of wear. They were like old friends. He assembled his full trauma kit, then turned his attention to a long, cloth-wrapped object at the bottom of the locker. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing his pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. It was a simple, reliable weapon, its wood stock worn smooth with use. To Robert, it was not a weapon of aggression, but a tool of survival, an essential piece of kit for anyone venturing deep into a wilderness inhabited by bears and cougars. It was a fundamental rule of safety he had never broken. He methodically disassembled it, cleaning each part with practiced efficiency before reassembling it with a series of solid, satisfying clicks. Buddy watched the entire process with an almost unsettling stillness. Lying on his worn blanket by the cold hearth, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes tracked Robert's every move. He could feel the shift in his human. The heavy cloak of melancholy that usually enveloped Robert had been replaced by an electric current of focused energy. This was the man Buddy knew from missions, the calm, confident leader he was trained to follow. When Robert pulled a specially designed canine harness from the chest, Buddy's tail gave a single, solid thump against the floor. He rose, stretched, and walked over, nudging the harness with his nose as if to say, "I'm ready when you are." Robert paused, looking down at his loyal companion. He knelt and cupped the dog's powerful head in his hands, pressing his forehead against Buddy's. "Can't do this without you, boy," he whispered. Buddy responded with a soft lick to his bearded cheek. The final preparations were for sustenance and survival, a supply of high-calorie food for man and dog, a water purification system, a compass, fire starters, an emergency beacon. He packed it all into his old military rucksack, each item positioned for optimal weight distribution and accessibility. The shotgun was secured to the side of the pack, easily reached, but out of the way. The pack was heavy, but it was a familiar weight, a burden he was glad to carry once more. He spent the evening sitting by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky, the full pack standing by the door like a silent sentinel. He didn't feel the familiar dread of the encroaching night. Tonight, his mind was clear, occupied not with what had been lost, but with what needed to be found. He was up before the sun the next morning. The air was cold and sharp, promising a clear day. He moved with a quiet efficiency, making a final check of his gear, topping off his canteen, and putting out a bowl of fresh food for Buddy. He dressed, not in his usual worn jeans, but in durable cargo pants and his sturdiest pair of hiking boots. As the first rays of sunlight cut through the tall firs, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Robert shouldered his pack. He took one last look around the small space that had been his refuge for so long, then turned to the door. As he opened it, the vast, silent wilderness greeted him. He took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. Buddy was already outside, standing at the head of the overgrown path, looking back at him, ready. Robert nodded. It was time. Together, the old para-rescueman and his faithful dog stepped out of the shadows of the past and into the light of their final mission. The wilderness did not give up its secrets easily. The first 2 days of the journey were a grueling testament to that fact. The overgrown path Robert had followed from his cabin quickly dissolved into a trackless expanse of dense forest. They were forced to navigate by compass and sun, bushwhacking through thorny blackberry brambles and over the slick, moss-covered corpses of fallen giants. For Robert, it was a return to a familiar dance. His body, despite a decade of disuse, remembered the rhythm of the wild. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the language of the land. He knew how to place his feet to avoid turning an ankle on the uneven ground, how to test the stability of a rock before committing his full weight. The skills were a part of him, etched into his very being, but his body was no longer the finely tuned instrument it had once been. He was 58, not 28. A dull ache settled deep in his lower back by the end of the first day, and his knees protested with every steep descent. He pushed the pain down, treating it as just another obstacle to overcome. But it was a constant, humbling reminder of the years stolen from him, not by age but by inertia. In this struggle, Buddy was more than a companion. He was an essential partner. The German shepherd moved through the undergrowth with a fluid grace Robert envied. When they came to a seemingly impassable wall of vegetation, Buddy would invariably find the weakest point, a nearly invisible game trail that would save them an hour of hard bushwhacking. He located a small, clear spring bubbling from a rock when their canteens were running low, his keen ears picking up the faint sound of running water long before Robert could. On the afternoon of the third day, Buddy's value shifted from guide to guardian. They were traversing a steep, rocky hillside when the dog suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He went rigid, head low, a deep, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. The hair along his spine stood on end. Robert froze instantly. His hand went not to the shotgun on his pack, but to the hilt of the large knife on his belt. It was a quieter, more immediate defense. He followed Buddy's fixed gaze up the slope. For a moment, he saw nothing but rocks and shadows. Then a flicker of movement on a wide ledge, some 50 feet above them. A mountain lion. It was lying flat, its tawny coat blending almost perfectly with the dry stone. It was a large male, its long tail twitching almost lazily as it watched them. It wasn't hunting, just observing, a silent king surveying his domain. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs, but his training took over. He made no sudden movements. The shotgun felt like a dead weight on his shoulder, a loud and powerful solution to a problem that didn't yet exist. A single shot would echo for miles through these canyons, and revealing his exact position in a forest that already felt strangely quiet and marked with unsettling signs, was a tactical error he was unwilling to make. He chose the silent path. He stood his ground, making himself look as large as possible without being aggressive. "Easy, boy," he murmured, in a low, calm voice to Buddy. The standoff was absolute, a moment of primal communication. Buddy did not bark or lunge. He simply held his position, a gray and white statue of unwavering courage, a clear message that he would defend his human to the death. After a long, tense minute that felt like an eternity, the mountain lion seemed to make a decision. It gave a dismissive flick of its tail, rose with a fluid, powerful grace, and melted back into the shadows of the rocks, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. Robert let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Adrenaline surged through him, leaving him trembling. He knelt and buried his face in Buddy's thick, coarse fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "What would I do without you?" That night, the adrenaline gave way to a bone-deep exhaustion. They made camp in a small clearing, and Robert built a small, controlled fire, more for comfort than for warmth. As he sat staring into the dancing flames, the stress of the past few days began to take its toll. The crackle of the fire began to sound like the hiss of wind-driven snow. The deep shadows of the forest began to look like the suffocating white-out of a blizzard. He was no longer in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. He was on the unforgiving slopes of Mount Rainier years ago. The wind howled in his ears. He could see the young climber's face, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror as Robert tried to clip him to the rescue line. He could feel the gut-wrenching lurch as a gust of wind tore the boy from the cliff's edge, his desperate cry swallowed by the storm. Robert began to hyperventilate, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, despite the heat from the fire. The world around him was dissolving, replaced by the blinding white hell of his greatest failure. He felt a sudden heavy pressure on his lap, a wet nose shoved forcefully against his cheek. Buddy had moved from his spot and laid his entire body across Robert's lap, pinning him down with his reassuring weight. The dog whined, a sound of deep concern, and licked away the tears Robert hadn't realized were streaming down his face. The solid, warm reality of the dog was an anchor in the turbulent chaos of his mind. Robert's hands, which had been clenched into useless fists, found their way to Buddy's fur. He gripped the thick coat, his knuckles white. He focused on the feeling of the dog's steady breathing, on the rhythmic thump of his tail against the ground, on the unwavering loyalty in his eyes. Slowly, painfully, the howling wind in his head began to subside. The image of the falling climber faded, replaced by the gentle, worried face of his dog. He sat there for a long time, his arms wrapped around Buddy, the old rescuer being saved by his own partner. The panic receded, leaving a familiar, hollow ache behind. The trail to Silent Falls was cold and hard, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the trail through his own past was the most dangerous of all. The morning after Robert's panic attack dawned cold and unforgiving. The hollow ache of his trauma remained, but its sharpest edges had been softened by a night of deep, restorative sleep with Buddy pressed against his side. The mission, his singular focus, pulled him forward. They broke camp in silence and continued their journey, Robert feeling a renewed, if fragile, sense of resolve. By midday, a new sound began to permeate the forest. A low, persistent roar that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the soles of Robert's boots. It was the sound of powerful water. According to his father's old map, they were approaching the Sisyphus River, which they needed to cross to continue toward the valley of Silent Falls. The map had shown a small, seasonal footbridge used by rangers and hunters. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached the bank, Robert's heart sank. The river was not the calm, crossable stream anticipated. It was a furious brown torrent, swollen and violent with meltwater from the high-altitude snowfields. The water churned and boiled, carrying whole logs and chunks of debris downstream at a terrifying speed. And where the bridge should have been, there was nothing but two splintered pilings, a testament to the river's overwhelming power. The way was blocked. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Robert. The thought of turning back, of failing before he had even reached his objective, was a bitter pill to swallow. He stared into the raging water, and for a second, felt it was a physical manifestation of the chaos in his own mind. He felt a nudge at his hand. Buddy was beside him, looking not at the river, but up at him, his gaze steady and unquestioning. The dog's total faith was a silent rebuke to his own momentary doubt. Robert took a deep breath, pushing the despair aside. He was a para-rescueman. An obstacle wasn't an endpoint. It was a problem to be solved. His eyes scanned the opposite bank. 50 feet of turbulent chaos away, he spotted what he was looking for. A massive, ancient cedar with a thick, sturdy trunk that stood a few yards back from the water's edge. It was the perfect anchor. The ritual began again, He unslung his heavy pack and uncoiled his rope. He pulled a small, powerful crossbow from a side pocket of the pack, a tool used for firing guidelines across ravines. He attached a lightweight but sturdy Kevlar line to a blunt-tipped bolt and tied the other end to his main climbing rope. He took aim, compensating for the wind. The crossbow twanged with a sharp crack, and the bolt flew true, trailing the thin line behind it. It struck the cedar with a solid thud, embedding itself deep in the bark. A small victory. He spent the next hour meticulously hauling the heavy climbing rope across the river, the current fighting him every inch of the way, threatening to drag it downstream. His muscles burned with the effort, sweat stinging his eyes. Finally, the rope was across. He secured his end to the base of an equally sturdy fir tree, pulling the line until it was as taut as a guitar string. He had created a Tyrolean traverse, a rope bridge that spanned the furious waters. The gear was the easy part. He clipped his pack and supplies to the rope with a carabiner and pulley, and sent them sliding to the other side. Now came the real test. He knelt in front of Buddy, showing him the special canine harness. "All right, boy," he said, his voice calm and steady, masking the anxiety churning in his gut. "This is it. You have to trust me. You have to trust me completely." Buddy whimpered softly, his eyes fixed on the frightening river. He was a rescue dog, not an aquatic specialist. He could swim, but this was different. This was a monster. Robert secured the harness around Buddy's body, making sure it was snug but not restrictive. He clipped a leash to the harness, then clipped the leash's handle to the main rope with another pulley. He would guide him across. Hand over hand, he waded into the freezing water up to his knees, the current immediately trying to tear his legs out from under him. He gripped the rope, his knuckles white. "Come on, Buddy. With me." Hesitantly, Buddy followed. The moment the frigid water hit his chest, the dog flinched but kept his eyes locked on Robert. Robert began to pull them across, his arms straining, the rope digging into his palms. The river fought them with a malevolent force. The roar was deafening, the spray as cold as ice. They were halfway across when a large, submerged log slammed into Robert's legs, knocking him off his feet. He plunged under the icy water, a brutal, shocking blow that stole his breath. He clung to the rope, his head breaking the surface a moment later, sputtering and gasping. The current tried to pull Buddy under, too, the dog paddling frantically, his eyes wide with fear. For one terrifying second, the image of the falling climber flashed through Robert's mind. Failure. But he shook it off, rage and determination surging through him. Not again. Not this time. "I've got you, Buddy!" he roared above the river's noise. "I've got you!" With an adrenaline-fueled surge of strength, he found his footing and pulled. He heaved with all his might, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind focused on one single thought: get his partner to safety. Painful step by painful step, they fought the current. Finally, his boots scraped against gravel. They had reached the other side. He collapsed on the riverbank, pulling Buddy close. Tangled on the shore with him, they lay there for several minutes, gasping, soaked, and shivering. Robert unclipped the dog's harness and wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in the dog's wet fur. Buddy licked his face, his tail beginning to give a weak thump, thump, thump on the ground. They had made it. It had cost them, but the victory was profound. Looking back at the turbulent river they had just conquered, Robert felt a flicker of his old confidence return. The mission was hard. The wilderness was unforgiving, but he and his partner, together, were stronger. Robert and Buddy took the rest of the day to recover from the river ordeal. They found a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang where Robert built a large fire. They huddled close to the heat, slowly drying their clothes and fur, the warmth a welcome comfort against the deep chill that had settled in their bones. The crossing had been a brutal, physically demanding trial, but as he shared a portion of his rations with Buddy, Robert felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had faced the river's fury and won. They set off the next morning with renewed purpose, venturing into the final leg of their journey. The terrain here was different. The forest was older, darker. The trees were ancient titans, their massive canopies interlocking high overhead, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. And with the change in landscape came a change in atmosphere. The cheerful chattering of birds and squirrels that had accompanied them for days began to fade away. The rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth ceased. A deep, unnatural silence descended, a silence that felt heavy and watchful. It was not the peaceful quiet of his cabin, but a tense, expectant hush, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Robert found himself walking more softly, his senses on high alert. It was Buddy who first noticed the markings. The dog stopped, his nose twitching, and let out a low, questioning whine. Robert followed his gaze to a large hemlock tree. Carved into its bark, about head high, was a strange symbol, a simple circle with a vertical line running through it. It was old. The edges of the cut were gray and weathered, but it was unmistakably man-made. Not an official Forest Service blaze. A few hundred yards later they found another, this time on a flat-faced boulder, and then another on a fallen log. They didn't mark a clear path, but seemed to form a vague, irregular perimeter. They felt less like guides and more like warnings, territorial markers. As the day wore on, the unsettling silence deepened, and Buddy's demeanor changed. He began to walk with his head low, his body tense, his tail held straight and stiff. He stayed so close to Robert's leg that his fur brushed against his trousers with every step. He was on edge, his usual calm confidence replaced by a nervous energy that communicated itself clearly to Robert. They came to a fork in a faint game trail. One path led down into a ravine, a seemingly more direct route. The other climbed up and around a steep, rocky hill. Robert, consulting his compass, saw that the ravine was the logical choice. It would save them at least an hour. He took a step in that direction, but was brought up short. Buddy planted his feet, refusing to move. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, then actively pushed against Robert's legs with his body, trying to herd him toward the higher path. "What is it, boy?" Robert asked softly, laying a hand on the dog's tense shoulders. "The ravine path." Buddy barked again, his tone one of pure agitation. He glanced toward the ravine, the hackles on his neck rising. Then he looked to the high path, then back to Robert, whining with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. Robert's training had taught him one invaluable lesson: always trust your dog. A trained dog's senses could perceive threats a human would miss. He had seen it time and again in the field. Ignoring Buddy's warning was not an option. "All right," Robert conceded, his own sense of unease growing. "All right. We go your way." The high path was a punishing scramble over loose rock and tangled roots that left Robert's legs burning and his lungs gasping for air. It took them nearly 2 hours to navigate the treacherous detour. When they finally descended back to the forest floor, they rejoined the game trail a quarter of a mile past the ravine. Curiosity gnawed at Robert. He needed to know what had spooked his partner so badly. Leaving Buddy with a firm command to stay, he dropped his pack and quietly doubled back toward the ravine entrance he'd bypassed. He moved with the practiced stealth of a soldier, his boots making almost no sound on the pine needle-covered ground. As he neared the spot where the trail forked, he saw it. Set right in the middle of the narrow path, half hidden by ferns, was a bear trap. It was a monstrous thing, a set of rusted steel jaws the size of a dinner plate, held open by a powerful spring mechanism. But it was the state of the trap that made his blood run cold. It had been sprung. The jaws were clamped shut, its cruel teeth biting into a thick branch that had fallen across the pressure plate. It had been there a long time, the metal weathered dark, the earth around it undisturbed. He stared at it, his mind racing. This was no ordinary trapper's gear. It hadn't been set on an animal trail, but a human one. Its purpose was not to catch game, but to maim or kill anyone unlucky enough to step on it. A chilling realization washed over him. His decision not to fire his rifle at the mountain lion had been the right one. A gunshot would have been a dinner bell, announcing his presence to whoever had set this trap. The silence of the forest, the strange warning signs, Buddy's frantic behavior, it all snapped into place. They were not alone out here. Someone else lived in this remote corner of the wilderness. Someone who had been here for a long, long time. Someone who did not want to be found. Someone living in a state of constant, defensive paranoia, willing to use lethal force to protect their isolation. Robert backed away slowly, his hand resting on Buddy's head for reassurance when he returned. The mission had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The discovery of the bear trap changed the very nature of the mission. The wilderness, which had been an impartial adversary since Rock River, now held a new, more unsettling threat. Man. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every snapped twig underfoot, a potential alert to a hostile presence. Robert moved with a renewed caution, his senses humming, every step a calculated risk. He was no longer just a rescuer on a mission. He was an intruder in someone else's fortified territory. He kept Buddy on a short lead, a decision that pained him but was necessary for stealth. They stayed off the game trails, keeping to the thicker woods, their progress slow and arduous. The constant vigilance was exhausting, a mental strain that was in some ways more draining than the physical exertion. Robert found himself scanning the trees, not for landmarks, but for signs of human habitation. A tripwire, another trap, the glint of a watchful eye. For hours, this tense, silent procession continued. The only sounds were their own muffled footsteps on the damp earth and the whisper of wind high in the canopy. The unnatural silence of the forest now felt like a suffocating blanket of paranoia. Yet, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, a new sound began to assert itself. A sound they had been walking toward for days. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration felt more than heard. Gradually, it grew into a distant, steady roar, the sound of the falls. As the sound of rushing water grew, Buddy's demeanor began to shift once more. The tense, defensive posture he had held since the discovery of the trap began to ease. He lifted his head, his nose twitching, testing the air. He pulled slightly on the leash, his focus shifting from the immediate surroundings to a scent on the wind. He let out a low, excited whine. Robert froze, watching his partner. This wasn't the agitated, warning growl from the day before. This was the sharp, focused sound of a search dog locking onto a target. Robert's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a surge of expectation cutting through the fear. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you smell?" Buddy pulled again, harder this time, his powerful body straining the leash. His nose was pointed directly toward the growing roar of the waterfall. Robert made a decision. He unclipped the leash. The potential danger of the forest's unseen inhabitant was still real, but the mission came first, and right now, Buddy was on the scent. Freed from restraint, Buddy took off, not at a run, but at a determined trot with his nose to the ground. He zigzagged through the trees with an unfailing sense of direction, pausing every so often to glance back, making sure Robert was following. Robert scrambled to keep up, his fatigue forgotten, his mind now fixed on the chase. He trusted Buddy's instincts implicitly. The dog wasn't on an animal trail. Robert knew the scent profile Buddy was trained to find. The smell of disturbed earth, of clothing, of human remains, and the faint ghostly scent of aviation fuel and oxidized metal. Scents that would linger for decades, undetectable to a human, but a blazing signpost for a dog like Buddy. They half ran, half stumbled through the dense undergrowth, the roar of the falls becoming a deafening, all-encompassing presence. Mist began to drift through the trees, cold and damp against Robert's skin, clinging to Buddy's gray and white fur. The ground grew steeper, dropping sharply toward a narrow, rocky gorge. Buddy led him right to the edge of a precipice. Below them, through a screen of ferns and dripping moss, was the source of the roar. The Silent Falls. It was a magnificent, heartbreaking sight. A ribbon of white water plunged over 300 feet from a sheer cliff face, crashing into a deep emerald pool below and sending a perpetual cloud of mist into the air. The scene was almost identical to his father's photograph, a place trapped in time, but there was no sign of a plane. Robert's heart sank with a wave of bitter disappointment. Had he been wrong? Had he dragged them all out here through all this danger for nothing? But Buddy was not discouraged. He let out a single, sharp, authoritative bark that cut through the roar of the water. He scrambled down a steep, treacherous slope, his claws finding purchase where Robert's boots slipped. He didn't lead him to the pool at the base of the falls, but along the gorge wall, pushing through a thick, thorny curtain of wild blackberry vines that concealed the rock face. Robert followed, thorns tearing at his shirt and scratching his arms. He pushed aside the last of the tangled vines, and then he froze. There it was, wedged into a deep recess of the cliff, partially sheltered by an overhang and almost completely consumed by the forest, was the wreckage of the Cessna. It was tilted at a grotesque angle, its nose buried deep in the earth. One wing sheared off and lying dozens of yards away. The fuselage was crumpled, its once white paint now a mottled camouflage of green moss, brown rust, and gray lichen. It was no longer a machine. It was a monument to a forgotten tragedy. A metal tomb sealed by 40 years of silence and neglect. Robert stood motionless, the roar of the waterfall filling his ears, the cold mist on his face. He felt no triumph, no thrill of discovery, just a deep, overwhelming sorrow. He knelt and placed a hand on Buddy's head, his fingers sinking into the dog's damp fur. "You found him, boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You found him." The roar of the falls was a constant, powerful requiem for the silent tomb before them. Robert stood for a long moment, simply bearing witness, his hand never leaving Buddy's head. He was no stranger to death or disaster, but the profound isolation of this place, the sheer length of time this secret had been kept, imbued the scene with a heavy, almost sacred stillness. This was hallowed ground. Taking a deep breath, he shifted back into the mindset of his training. There was a protocol for this, a way to approach a scene with respect, but also with purpose. He gave Buddy a silent command to stay, and the dog sat, a stoic, gray and white sentinel watching over the wreckage. Robert approached the cockpit cautiously, his boots crunching on rusted metal and shattered glass. The plexiglass of the windscreen was long gone, leaving a gaping hole. He peered inside. The interior was a ruin, ravaged by 40 years of moisture and decay. The upholstery had rotted away, revealing the metal frames of the seats, and a fine green moss coated nearly every surface. And there, slumped in the pilot's seat, was what he knew he would find: the skeletal remains of the pilot, still partially held by the tattered remnants of a seatbelt. The sight was grim, but Robert felt no fear, only a deep, professional sadness. He had seen this too many times before. He said a silent prayer for the soul that had met its end here, alone and forgotten. His mission was to change that. His trained eyes scanned the small cabin, searching for anything that might have survived. Most of the contents had turned to compost, but under the co-pilot's seat, wedged tightly against the floor, was a dark green military-style gear case. It was dented and scratched, but its sturdy metal construction had kept it intact. He recognized it as a waterproof hard case, the kind used by soldiers and field researchers. Sharp, clear hope cut through his sorrow. He carefully worked the case free from the wreckage. The latches were stiff with corrosion, but with some effort, they gave way with a loud snap. The hardened rubber seal around the lid, though brittle with age, had done its job. He lifted the lid, and the air that escaped smelled not of decay, but of old paper and leather. Inside, nestled in what was once protective foam, was a single object: a handsome, leather-bound journal. He lifted it out with a reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts. The leather was stiff and darkened by moisture, but it was whole. He opened the cover. The pages were yellowed and brittle, crumbling at the corners. The ink, a dark blue, was faded and blurred in spots, but it was still legible. The first page bore a name in a strong, confident hand: Daniel Monroe, 1978. Robert sat on a moss-covered log a short distance from the wreckage, the roar of the falls a constant backdrop. He began to read, and as he did, the story of the lost plane and its pilot finally began to unfold. Daniel Monroe was not a pilot by trade. He was an investigative journalist from Seattle. His journal entries, articulate and detailed, painted a portrait of a man on the most dangerous assignment of his life. He was investigating a powerful logging company, accusing them of illegal clear-cutting in protected national forests and of bribing federal officials to look the other way. The first entries were filled with frustration, of close calls and the names of sources who were too afraid to go on the record. But then, he'd found his proof. A disgruntled company insider had given him a set of maps detailing the illegal operations, along with a ledger of the payoffs. He had the story. He just had to get it out. The last entries, written in the days leading up to the crash, were chilling. Monroe was convinced he was being followed. He wrote of strange cars parked outside his apartment, of clicks on his phone line. He knew that flying out of Seattle on a commercial airline was too risky, so he chartered a small private plane, a Cessna, from a small airfield in a neighboring county. The final entry, written 40 years ago to the day, laid the conspiracy bare. To throw them off, Monroe wrote, I've filed a false flight plan heading east, toward Idaho. My real destination is south. To a colleague in Oregon I trust to publish this. I suspect they may have tampered with the plane. I've checked it myself, but I'm a journalist, not a mechanic. I pray it's just my paranoia. He had added one last haunting paragraph. The ELT, the emergency transmitter, seems to be malfunctioning. The mechanic said it was a faulty switch, but I have a bad feeling. If the worst happens if I don't make it, I hope someone finds this. The truth has to come out. The date is October 12th, 1978. A historic storm is forecast for this afternoon. May it be the wind at my back. Robert closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. It all made sense now. The false flight plan meant no one was looking in the right state, let alone the right forest. The sabotage transmitter meant the plane sent no distress signal, and the historic storm, the very one Robert remembered his father mentioning, would have erased any immediate signs of a crash, making a search impossible. Daniel Monroe hadn't just crashed. He had been deliberately silenced. Robert looked from the journal to the wreckage, then to the waterfall, the silent guardian of this 40-year-old secret. His mission, he now understood, was far from over. It had just begun. He wasn't just here to recover a body. He was here to recover the truth. As Robert closed the journal, the world seemed to shift. The roar of the waterfall was no longer just the sound of water. It was the voice of the past, a 40-year-old cry for justice. The weight of Daniel Monroe's story settled on him, a responsibility he now shared. He carefully placed the journal back in its waterproof case and secured it in his pack. His purpose was clear, but the forest had other plans. The sky, which had been clear and blue just an hour before, had turned a threatening shade of bruised gray. The wind began to howl down the gorge, ripping leaves from the trees and whipping a cold, stinging mist from the falls across the wreckage. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed off the cliffs. The historic storm that had sealed Daniel Monroe's fate seemed to have a modern echo, and it was closing in on them fast. "We need to find shelter, buddy," Robert said, raising his voice over the rising wind. The flimsy tent in his pack would be shredded in minutes. His eyes fell on the only viable option, the broken fuselage of the Cessna. It was a grim choice, a tomb, but it was their only chance. He helped Buddy into the cramped rear of the cabin, then squeezed in behind him just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The downpour was instant and violent, a sheet of water that hammered against the plane's thin aluminum skin, creating a deafening din. The world outside the broken windscreen dissolved into a gray, waterlogged blur. Inside the wreckage, it was dark and claustrophobic. Robert and Buddy huddled together, the smell of rust and damp earth heavy in the air. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Robert saw movement near the front of the cabin. He froze. A figure was emerging from the deep shadows of the cockpit, unfolding itself like a phantom. It was a man, old and gaunt, his frame little more than skin and bone beneath layers of tattered, mismatched clothing. A long, matted gray beard and wild, unkempt hair framed a face so deeply lined and weathered it looked like a piece of ancient wood. But it was his eyes that locked Robert in place. They were pale, haunted, and burning with a mixture of fear and the fierce defensiveness of a cornered animal. In one trembling hand, the man held a large, rusted hunting knife. It was the man who had set the traps, the silent inhabitant of the woods. Buddy let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the small space. He moved to place himself between Robert and the stranger, his body a rigid wall of protective muscle. "Easy, boy," Robert commanded softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He placed a firm hand on Buddy's back, a signal to hold his ground but not to attack. With his other hand, he slowly raised it, palm open and empty, showing he was not a threat. The rifle was still slung over his shoulder, a clear statement that he could defend himself. But the open hand was a gesture of non-aggression. The old man's eyes darted from Robert's face to his open hand, to the rifle, then to Buddy. Finally, his gaze fell on the open gear case on the floor. "You found it," he rasped, his voice a dry, rough whisper, as if it hadn't been used in years. "You found it." His words hung in the air between them. The tension was so thick, it might have been cut with the old man's rusty knife. Outside, the storm raged, a perfect mirror for the turbulence inside the cramped fuselage. "Daniel Monroe," Robert said. The name was a key turning in a 40-year-old lock. "I'm here because of him." The old man flinched as if struck. His shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of him. The knife in his hand lowered, and he sank into the co-pilot's seat, his face collapsing into a mask of utter despair. "Daniel Monroe," he repeated the name, a prayer and a curse. After a long silence, the old man whispered, "My name is Simon." His gaze was lost in the rain-streaked void beyond the windshield. "And I'm the reason he's here." The confession, when it came, was a torrent, a flood of guilt and memory dammed up for 4 decades. Simon wasn't the wreckage's guardian. He was its prisoner. Back then, he wasn't a woodsman, but a young aircraft mechanic, just 20 years old, working at the small airfield Monroe used. He was good at his job, but he was in debt, and the logging company found his weakness. They gave him no choice. They threatened him. They threatened his family. All he had to do, they said, was tamper with the emergency transmitter and drain a little fuel. Just enough to bring the plane down in a remote, wild patch of forest where no one would ever find it. "I was a kid," Simon said, his voice cracking, tears carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I was scared. I told myself it would be okay, that he'd just have to walk out. But then the storm came. That terrible storm. I knew I had sent him to his death." The guilt consumed him. He quit his job, left his family, and vanished, taking refuge in the very wilderness that held his crime. He built a life here, a hermit's existence as a form of penance. The strange symbols were his warnings. The traps, his brutal last resort. Security to keep anyone from finding the wreckage, from unearthing the sin that had defined his entire life. Robert listened, his heart aching with a familiar sorrow. He looked at this broken man, haunted by a single, catastrophic failure, and saw a reflection of himself. The face of the young climber on Mount Rainier flashed through his mind. He knew this man's prison. He had lived in a version of it for 10 years. Outside, the storm began to slacken, its fury spent. The driving rain softened to a steady drumming. A watery shaft of light broke through the clouds. Robert reached into his pack and pulled out the journal. He offered it to Simon. The old man stared at it, his hand trembling too much to take it. He knew, Robert said gently. He wrote that he suspected the plane was tampered with. He knew it wasn't just one person's fault. It was a small lie, a slight twisting of Monroe's words, but it was an act of mercy. A lifetime of guilt had been punishment enough. For the first time in 40 years, Simon looked at another human being without fear, and in Robert's eyes he found not judgment, but a deep and heartfelt understanding. The relief had begun. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening under a weak sun. Inside the wrecked Cessna, the oppressive blackness had been replaced by a soft, gray light. The air was no longer charged with tension, but with a fragile, tentative peace. Simon, who hours before had been a creature of shadows and fear, now seemed a different man. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a weary but clear-eyed resolve. The 40-year burden he had carried alone had finally been shared, and in the sharing, its crushing weight had been eased. "I'll go with you," Simon said. His voice was no longer a rasp, but quiet and steady. "I'll tell them everything I know. It's the least I can do for him." Robert looked at the old man, seeing not the hermit who set traps, but the terrified 20-year-old boy who had been ensnared in one. He nodded. "We'll go together." The journey back was a different ordeal than the journey in. It became Robert's final rescue mission. Simon knew this forest better than any map, guiding them along nearly invisible game trails. Though his wiry frame was surprisingly resilient after 40 years of hardship, the trek was still an exhausting trial for his aging body. Robert had to use his skills not just for himself, but for Simon, setting ropes for steep descents and carefully helping him across treacherous terrain. Buddy seemed to understand the shift in dynamics. The dog, who had been a rigid wall of defense against Simon, now acted as a gentle bridge between the two men. He walked between them, his presence a calm, non-judgmental reassurance. Occasionally, he would nudge Simon's hand with his wet nose, and the old man, after some hesitation, would rest a trembling hand on the dog's head, a fleeting smile touching his lips for the first time in decades. When they finally emerged from the forest days later, the modern world was a shock to Simon's system. The sight of cars, the noise, the sheer number of people, it left him stunned. Robert acted as his steady guide, shielding him from the overwhelming stimuli and steering him to his truck with a protective hand on his shoulder. The first stop was not the sheriff's office, but the office of a small-town lawyer Robert knew he could trust. From there, the story of Daniel Monroe, supported by his journal and the sworn testimony of a man named Simon, was carefully delivered to a state prosecutor and a veteran reporter from a major Seattle newspaper. When it broke, the story didn't just make a ripple, it sent a shockwave. The tale of the missing journalist, the 40-year-old conspiracy, and the hermit who held the key to it all captivated the public. An official investigation was launched. The logging company, though under new ownership, could not escape the crimes of its past. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outrage, it was held accountable, forced to pay massive fines and fund a large-scale reforestation project in the very lands it had illegally clear-cut. A formal recovery mission, guided by Robert, returned to Silent Falls. Daniel Monroe's remains were brought out of the wilderness with the dignity and honor he had so long been denied. A memorial service was held, attended by reporters, environmental activists, and distant relatives of Monroe who had never known what became of him. He was no longer a forgotten man, but a hero who had died for the truth. Through it all, Robert was a quiet, steady presence. He watched Simon, now clean-shaven and in new clothes, bravely face the cameras and the courts. His testimony was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. He saw the relief on the faces of Monroe's family. He had completed his mission. He had brought someone home. On a cool autumn evening weeks later, Robert sat on the porch of his cabin. The air was crisp. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the sunset painted the Cascade peaks in hues of orange and purple. Buddy lay at his feet, his head on his paws, content. The nightmares hadn't vanished entirely, but they had changed. The image of the young climber falling from Mount Rainier was still there, a scar on his soul, but it no longer had the power to destroy him. It was the memory of a tragedy, not a verdict on his life. He had failed that day, but he had not failed Daniel Monroe. In watching Simon's path to redemption, he realized that one failure did not have to be a life sentence. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a decade. The cabin was no longer a prison or a fortress. It was a home, and it was about to become something more. On the small table beside him lay a piece of paper and a pen. He picked them up and began to write. He was drafting a proposal, a plan, to start a new volunteer search and rescue training program for young people in the surrounding counties. He would use his skills and experience not to hide from the world, but to serve it once more. He would teach them how to navigate the wilderness, how to save lives, and most importantly, how to support their partners when the mission was over. He looked out at the vast, beautiful wilderness that had almost broken him. It had been the setting of his greatest failure, and the stage for his redemption. He had walked into it to find a dead man's story, and in the process, had finally found his own way back to life. In the silent loyalty of a loving animal, we often find the strength to face our own past. The story of Robert and Buddy reminds us that the path to healing is never walked alone, and that true purpose can be found in the missions we least expect. If these stories of courage and companionship mean something to you, you are welcome in our community. You can support us by sharing your thoughts in a comment and subscribing, so more stories like these can be told. Our next journey is ready to begin. Just click on the video that has appeared on your screen.